The scream that tore through the royal chambers of Castral Castle was not one of pain, but of betrayal. Elena stood frozen in the doorway of the council hall, her hand pressed against the swell of her belly, staring at the parchment pinned to the announcement board. Her husband's seal was stamped at the bottom in blood-red wax. The words above it were simple and final. King Damien of Castral was to be wed to Princess Seraphine of Ashworth within the month. She had heard rumors for weeks. Servants who stopped talking when she entered a room. Guards who would not meet her eyes. She had dismissed it all as court gossip, the kind that always circled a queen who had risen from nothing. But parchment did not lie. Wax seals did not lie. And now, 6 months pregnant with the heir to the Castral throne, Elena understood that the man she loved had chosen his crown over her, without ever telling her to her face. She did not cry. Not yet. She folded her hands over her stomach, and walked toward the throne room, where she knew he would be, surrounded by his council, planning a wedding to another woman, while his true wife carried his child in silence. 6 months earlier, none of this seemed possible. Elena had been an Omega from the small border pack of Thornhollow, a place known more for its wheat fields than its politics. She had never expected to catch the eye of an Alpha King, let alone marry one. But Damien had come to Thornhollow during a diplomatic tour, and something about the quiet strength in her eyes had stopped him mid-stride at a village gathering. Within 3 months they were married, in a ceremony that stunned both kingdoms. Within 4, she was carrying his child. Elena remembered the way he used to look at her before all of this, like she was the only steady thing in a world built on shifting alliances and whispered threats. He would trace the curve of her growing belly with careful fingers and speak softly about the future, about raising their child together, about teaching them to ride horses along the eastern cliffs, where he had learned as a boy. She believed him completely. She had no reason not to. But kings, she was learning, belonged to more than just their families. The throne room doors were heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands, that had survived 3 sieges. Elena pushed them open herself, refusing the guards who moved to assist her. Inside, seated at the long table beneath the banners of Castral, sat Damien, flanked by his council. At the head of that council sat Lord Cassian, the king's most trusted advisor, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. Every head turned when Elena entered. Conversation stopped. Damien rose from his seat so quickly that his chair scraped loudly against the stone floor. "Elena," he said, his voice catching on her name in a way she had once found endearing and now found unbearable. She held up the parchment she had torn from the announcement board. Her hand did not shake, though inside she felt as though the ground itself had opened beneath her feet. "Is this true?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, but it carried through the entire hall. Damien's jaw tightened. He glanced at Cassian, who gave the smallest shake of his head, a silent warning not to explain himself in front of the council. But Elena was his wife. She deserved more than silence. "We need to speak privately," Damien said, moving toward her. "No," Elena said, stepping back. "I want an answer here, in front of everyone who will watch you break this promise. Is it true?" The council members shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away. Others watched with open curiosity, hungry for the kind of drama that would fuel court gossip for months. Cassian remained perfectly still, his fingers steepled in front of him, watching the scene unfold like a man observing a chess match he had already won. "It is necessary," Damien finally said. The words landed like stones. "Necessary," Elena repeated. She felt something inside her chest crack, quiet and final, like ice breaking on a lake in early spring. "Necessary for what?" "For the kingdom," he said. "Ashworth has been amassing forces along our northern border for 2 months. Their king has made it clear that an alliance through marriage is the only way to prevent war. Thousands of lives, Elena. Our people. I did not choose this because I wanted it. But you chose it," she said. "You chose it without telling me. You let me hear about it from servants in the hallway." "I was going to tell you," Damien said, his voice softer now, pleading. "I wanted to find the right moment. I did not want to upset you while you carry our child." Elena felt the child in question shift beneath her ribs, as though even the unborn baby understood the weight of the moment. She placed a protective hand over her belly. "You did not want to upset me," she repeated, "so instead you let me find out from gossip while you sit here with your council, deciding my fate along with your kingdom's." The council fell into an uneasy silence. Lord Cassian finally spoke, his tone smooth as polished stone. "Your Majesty," he said, addressing Elena with a formality that felt more like mockery than respect. "Please understand that the king's marriage to Princess Seraphine is a political necessity. It changes nothing about your position here. You will remain comfortable. Your child will be cared for." "My position," Elena said, turning her gaze to Cassian for the first time. "And what position is that, exactly?" "Second wife, mistress, forgotten queen." No one answered her. Damien stepped closer, reaching for her hand, but she pulled it away before he could touch her. "Elena, please," he said. "Nothing will change between us. I will still love you. Our child will still be my heir. Seraphine's marriage is only a formality to secure peace. You and I both know that political unions rarely involve true affection. My heart belongs to you." Elena studied his face, searching for the man she had fallen in love with beneath the crown and the weight of his duty. She found traces of him still there, in the crease of worry between his brows, in the way his hands trembled slightly at his sides. But it did not matter anymore. Love that hid in shadows was not enough to build a life on, let alone raise a child in. "You speak of formality," she said, "as if I am a woman who can share her husband with another, and simply smile through it. As if our child should grow up watching their father crowned beside a stranger, while their mother is kept quietly out of sight." "It will not be like that," Damien insisted. "It already is," Elena said. She turned to leave, and Damien moved to follow her, but Cassian placed a hand on his arm, a gentle but firm restraint. "The king's council needs him, my king," Cassian said quietly. "There will be time to speak with the queen later, in private, where these matters belong." Elena did not wait to hear whether Damien would argue. She walked out of the throne room with her head high, though her heart felt as though it had been carved from her chest and left on the cold stone floor behind her. The following days passed in a haze of formal silence. Damien came to her chambers each evening, knocking softly, asking to speak, to explain, to make things right. Elena allowed him in only twice. Both times, the conversation circled the same exhausting points. He spoke of duty and necessity. She spoke of trust and betrayal. Neither of them moved an inch closer to understanding. On the third evening, Elena sat by the window of her chambers, watching the torches along the castle wall flicker against the darkening sky. Her lady-in-waiting, a kind young woman named Marisol, entered quietly, with a tray of tea that Elena had no interest in drinking. "They say the wedding preparations have already begun, my queen," Marisol said carefully, setting the tray down. "Seamstresses were called to the East Wing this morning. I am sorry to be the one to tell you." Elena closed her eyes. Of course they had. Of course the machinery of the kingdom moved forward without pause, indifferent to the woman carrying the king's child, in a room down the hall from where his wedding, to another woman, was already being stitched together thread by thread. "Thank you for telling me, Marisol," Elena said quietly. "I would rather know the truth than be shielded from it." Marisol hesitated at the door. "My queen," she said, "if I may speak freely." "Please," Elena said. "You do not have to stay and watch this happen," Marisol said. "There are places in this kingdom, and beyond it, where a woman with your strength could build a good life. I only say this because I have watched you these past months, and I do not think you are the kind of woman who waits quietly for scraps of a man's attention." The words settled into Elena's chest like a seed planted in fertile soil. She had not allowed herself to consider leaving, not truly, not as a real possibility. She had assumed she would have to accept whatever place was carved out for her, however small, however humiliating. But Marisol's words opened a door Elena had not realized was there. That night, Elena did not sleep. She lay awake staring at the ceiling of the chamber that had once felt like a sanctuary and now felt like a gilded cage. She thought about her child, growing steadily inside her, unaware of the storm swirling around the world they would soon be born into. She thought about the quiet fields of Thornhollow, the village she had left behind for a love that had promised her everything and was already beginning to take it all away. She thought about Damien's face in the throne room, the way he had said the word necessary, as though it could excuse everything else. She thought about Cassian's smooth, careful voice, the way he had spoken of her position as though she were a piece on a board being moved according to someone else's strategy. By the time the first light of dawn touched the castle walls, Elena had made a decision. She would not wait to be quietly tucked away while Damien built a new life beside Seraphine. She would not raise her child in the shadow of a marriage that was never meant to include them. Whatever came next, whatever it cost her, she would decide her own future instead of allowing the throne room to decide it for her. She rose from bed, dressed in simple clothing instead of her usual royal garments, and began, for the first time since arriving at Kestrel Castle, to plan a life that belonged entirely to her. The morning brought with it an unexpected visitor. Elena had barely finished dressing when a soft knock came at her chamber door. She expected Marisol, perhaps with news of further wedding preparations she did not wish to hear. Instead, she found an older woman standing in the hallway, dressed in the simple brown robes of a palace healer, her gray hair tied back in a practical knot. "My queen," the woman said, bowing her head. "My name is Nora. I have tended to the royal family's health for many years. I heard what happened in the throne room, and I wish to check on you and the child, if you would allow it." Elena studied the woman for a long moment, before stepping aside to let her in. There was something steady and honest in Nora's face, something that made Elena trust her instinctively, in a way she had not trusted anyone since arriving at the castle, aside from Marisol. Nora examined her carefully, checking her pulse, the position of the child, the color in her cheeks. Throughout the examination, she spoke little, but her presence was calming, a quiet anchor in a room that had felt like it was spinning out of control for days. "The child is healthy," Nora said finally. "Strong heartbeat. You are carrying well, despite the stress you have been under. But stress is not good for either of you, my queen. You must find a way to protect your peace, whatever that requires." Elena looked at the healer carefully. Something in the way Nora phrased her words felt deliberate, as though she were offering more than medical advice. "What would you do?" Elena asked quietly. "If you were me?" Nora was silent for a moment, gathering her supplies back into her worn leather bag. "I am only a healer, my queen," she said. "But I have lived long enough to know that some walls, no matter how beautiful they are built, are not meant to hold certain people forever. I have a sister who lives in a village 3 days' ride from here, a quiet place called Millbrook. She has helped women before who needed a fresh start, away from prying eyes. I only mention this because you asked what I would do, and I would not wish to see you trapped in a life that brings you nothing but sorrow." Elena felt her pulse quicken, not from fear this time, but from the first real spark of hope she had felt in days. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You do not know me." Nora smiled faintly. "Because I have watched queens come and go in this castle for 30 years, she said. "And you are the first one who looked at her own unhappiness and decided to do something about it, instead of simply enduring it. That kind of strength deserves help, not judgment." Before Elena could respond, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, and both women fell silent. A moment later, Damien appeared in the doorway, his expression tight with exhaustion and worry. He glanced between Elena and Nora, something unreadable passing across his face. "I did not mean to interrupt," he said. Nora bowed respectfully and excused herself, leaving Elena alone with her husband for the first time in 2 days. Damien stepped further into the room, his eyes taking in the plain clothing Elena wore, so different from the elaborate gowns she usually favored. "Are you well?" he asked. "Is the child well?" "We are both well," Elena said carefully, giving nothing away. Damien ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit she recognized from the early days of their courtship, back when he had been trying to find the right words to ask for her hand. "Elena," he said, "I know I have hurt you. I know explanations will never be enough to undo what has been done. But I need you to understand that I am not choosing Seraphine over you in my heart. I am choosing peace for our kingdom, for our child's future. If war comes to our borders, our son or daughter will inherit nothing but ashes and grief." Elena listened to his words, and for a moment, she almost let herself believe them again. But then she remembered the parchment on the announcement board, the way she had learned of his engagement from servants instead of from him, the casual way Cassian had spoken of her position, as though it were a matter already settled without her input. "If you truly believed I mattered as much as you claim," Elena said quietly, "you would have told me the truth before it became public record. You would have asked what I thought, what I feared, what I needed to hear from you. Instead, you decided everything without me. and expected me to simply accept it because you called it necessary. Damien's shoulders sagged. What would you have me do, Elena? He asked, his voice breaking slightly. Refuse the alliance and risk war. Watch our people suffer because I chose my own happiness over their safety. I would have you be honest with me, Elena said. That is all I ever wanted. Not a perfect solution to an impossible situation, just honesty, and I did not receive that. I received silence and secrecy, and then a public announcement that told the entire kingdom my place in your life before you ever told me yourself. Damien had no answer for that. He stood in the doorway, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides, a king who commanded armies and negotiated treaties, utterly powerless in the face of his own wife's grief. I need time, Elena said finally. Please, give me space to think. Damien nodded slowly, though the pain in his eyes suggested he understood, on some level, that the space Elena was asking for might become permanent. He turned and left without another word, and Elena sat alone in the quiet of her chamber, one hand resting on her belly, feeling the future she had once imagined slipping further away with each passing hour. That evening, Elena found Nora again, in the healer's quarters, near the castle's eastern wing. The older woman looked up from a collection of dried herbs she was sorting, and offered a small, knowing smile. You have made a decision, she said. It was not a question. I want to know more about Millbrook, Elena said. Nora nodded slowly, and set down her herbs. Then let us talk, my queen, she said. And let us talk carefully, because walls in this castle have more ears than you might think. Over the following days, Elena moved through the castle with careful, deliberate calm, giving no outward sign of the plans forming beneath the surface. She attended meals when required, exchanged polite conversation with courtiers, who watched her with poorly disguised curiosity, and endured the growing whispers about the upcoming royal wedding, with a composure that surprised even herself. Behind the scenes, Nora helped her gather what she would need. A modest sum of coin, saved carefully from Elena's own allowance over the past months, enough to sustain her through the early days of a new life, without drawing attention to sudden withdrawals from the royal treasury. Simple traveling clothes, plain and unremarkable, nothing that would mark her as a woman of noble birth. A letter of introduction to Nora's sister in Millbrook, sealed and ready to be delivered upon Elena's arrival. Marisol, when she learned of the plan, insisted on helping as well, gathering information about the guard rotations along the castle's western gate, the quietest hours when a woman might slip away unnoticed. You do not have to do this, Elena told her one evening, as Marisol helped braid her hair by candlelight. You could lose your position here, or worse, if anyone learns you helped me. Marisol met her eyes in the mirror's reflection, her expression fierce and unwavering. My queen, she said, I would rather lose my position helping you find happiness than keep it watching you disappear into misery. Some things matter more than safety. Elena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, the first she had allowed herself since the day of the throne room announcement. She reached back and squeezed Marisol's hand in silent gratitude, unable to trust her voice in that moment. The days moved quickly after that, each one bringing Elena closer to a decision that felt both terrifying and, for the first time in weeks, entirely her own. She watched the wedding preparations unfold around her with a strange, detached calm, knowing that by the time Seraphine arrived at Kestrel Castle in her wedding finery, Elena intended to be far beyond the reach of the kingdom's politics, raising her child in a place where no crown, no counsel, and no broken promise could touch them. Damien tried, in his own way, to reach her during those final days. He sent flowers to her chamber, small notes expressing his continued devotion, invitations to walk together in the castle gardens, as they once had during their courtship. Elena accepted none of them, though each gesture stirred a complicated ache in her chest, a reminder of the love that had once felt so certain, and now felt like a beautiful lie she had believed for far too long. On the final evening before her planned departure, Elena stood at the window of her chamber, looking out over the kingdom that had, for a brief time, felt like home. Somewhere beyond those walls, a life waited for her, uncertain and unwritten, but entirely her own to shape. She placed both hands over her belly, feeling the gentle movement of the child within, and made a quiet promise into the darkness. Whatever came next, whatever sacrifices the path ahead demanded, She would give her child something Damien's crown could never offer. A mother who chose them, fully and without hesitation, over every other obligation the world tried to place above them. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles over a castle in the hours between midnight and dawn, when even the most vigilant guards begin to grow weary and the torches burn low along the stone corridors. Elena moved through her chamber one final time, running her fingers along the edge of the windowsill, the carved wood of her writing desk, the soft fabric of the curtains that had framed her view of the kingdom for the past several months. She was not saying goodbye to a home. She understood now that this castle had never truly been that. It had been a beautiful stage, on which she had played a role that was never entirely her own to keep. She wore the plain traveling clothes Nora had helped her gather, a simple woolen cloak pulled over her shoulders to ward off the cold night air and to hide the shape of her pregnancy from any curious eyes she might encounter along the way. In a small leather satchel, she carried the coin she had saved, the letter of introduction to Nora's sister, and a single item she could not bring herself to leave behind, a small carved wooden bird that Damien had given her during their courtship, a token from the early days when his love had felt uncomplicated and true. Marisol met her at the servants' entrance near the western gate, her face pale with worry, but her resolve unshaken. "Everything is arranged," she whispered. "The guards on this shift are the ones I told you about. They will be occupied with their card game near the eastern barracks for at least another hour. A cart will be waiting for you at the crossroads just beyond the tree line. The driver has been paid and asks no questions." Elena embraced her tightly, memorizing the warmth of the friendship that had carried her through the darkest weeks of her life. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." "Be safe, my queen," Marisol said, her voice thick with emotion. "And be happy. That is all I truly want for you." Elena slipped through the servants' entrance and into the cool night air, moving carefully along the shadowed edges of the castle grounds, exactly as Marisol had instructed. Her heart pounded with every step, each sound in the darkness sending a fresh wave of fear through her chest. She thought of nothing but the child within her, the future she was walking toward, and the past she was leaving behind, piece by piece, with every step that carried her further from the castle walls. She reached the tree line just as the moon began to dip lower in the sky, and true to Marisol's word, a simple wooden cart waited at the crossroads, its driver a weathered older man who asked no questions and offered no judgment, only a nod, as Elena climbed aboard and settled herself among the sacks of grain that would serve as her cover should anyone stop the cart along the road. As the cart began to move, carrying her away from Kestrel Castle and everything it had once promised her, Elena allowed herself, finally, to look back. The castle stood silhouetted against the night sky, its towers dark and silent, its promises broken and left behind among the stones. Somewhere within those walls, Damien slept, unaware that by morning, his wife and unborn child would be gone, chasing a future he had no part in shaping. Elena turned forward again, facing the dark road ahead, and did not look back a second time. Whatever waited for her at the end of this journey, whatever hardships or joys the future held, she was walking toward it as her own woman, carrying her child not as a pawn in a kingdom's political games, but as the most precious thing in a life she was finally, fully, choosing for herself. The cart rolled on through the darkness, carrying Elena further from the only home she had known as a queen, and closer to a life she had not yet imagined, but was determined to build with her own hands, one quiet, uncertain step at a time. Dawn broke over Kestrel Castle with an unusual stillness, the kind that made even the most seasoned staff pause without quite knowing why. Marisol arrived at Elena's chamber at the usual hour, carrying a tray of warm bread and tea, and found the room empty, the bed untouched, the wardrobe stripped of its plainest garments. She set the tray down with trembling hands and closed the door quietly behind her, saying nothing to anyone, exactly as she and Elena had planned. It was not until midday, when Damien sent a servant to request Elena's presence at a private luncheon, that the truth began to surface. The servant returned pale and stammering, reporting that the queen could not be found anywhere within the castle grounds. Damien dismissed it at first as a misunderstanding, certain that Elena had simply retreated to the gardens or the library to avoid another difficult conversation. But as the hours passed and no sign of her emerged, a cold unease began to settle over him. By evening, the entire castle staff had been questioned. Guards reported no unusual activity at any of the main gates. The stables confirmed that no royal horses had been taken. It was only when Cassian, ever thorough, ordered a search of the servants' quarters and lesser-used passages that a guard on the western gate finally admitted, under pressure, that he had been occupied elsewhere during a portion of his shift the previous night, unaware of anything amiss. Damien stood in the throne room as the pieces came together, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something far heavier. "She left," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. She actually left. Cassian, standing at his usual place near the council table, folded his hands calmly in front of him. "It appears so, my king," he said, "though perhaps this resolves matters more simply than we anticipated. With the former queen no longer present, the wedding to Princess Seraphine can proceed without complication." Damien turned on him with a fury that made even the hardened advisor take a step back. "Complication," Damien repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "She is carrying my child, Cassian, my heir. This is not a complication to be resolved. This is a woman I failed, a woman I drove away with my own choices, and you speak of it as though it were a fortunate turn of events." Cassian's composure cracked only slightly before he recovered it. "My apologies, Your Majesty," he said smoothly. "I only meant to offer perspective in a difficult moment. Shall I organize search parties to bring her back?" Damien was silent for a long moment, staring at the empty throne beside his own, the one that had, for a brief time, belonged to Elena. Part of him wanted to send every guard in the kingdom out into the night to find her, to drag her back to the castle, and force her to listen to every apology he had left unspoken. But another part of him, quieter and more honest, understood that Elena had not simply wandered off in confusion. She had made a choice, deliberately and with help, to leave behind the life he had built around her, without her consent. "No," Damien said finally. "No search parties. Not yet." Cassian raised an eyebrow but said nothing further, recognizing the storm behind the king's carefully controlled expression, and choosing, for once, not to provoke it further. That night, Damien sat alone in his private study, a single candle burning low on his desk, Elena's absence pressing down on him, with a weight he had not expected. He thought of every moment over the past weeks when he could have chosen differently, could have told her the truth before the announcement rather than after, could have fought harder against Cassian's insistence on secrecy and political convenience. Each memory arrived with fresh regret, and by the time the candle burned down to nothing, Damien understood, with a clarity that frightened him, that he had lost something far more valuable than a political alliance could ever replace. Meanwhile, many miles away, the cart carrying Elena rolled steadily along quiet country roads, moving further from Castral with each passing hour. She had slept fitfully among the sacks of grain, waking often to check the position of the moon, to reassure herself that the child within her remained calm, despite the rough movement of the road beneath them. The driver, true to his word, asked nothing of her, offering only the occasional nod and a share of his simple provisions when they stopped to rest the horses. By the second day, the landscape had begun to shift, rolling hills giving way to denser forest, the kind of quiet, untouched countryside that felt worlds away from the political intrigue of Castral Castle. Elena found herself breathing more easily with each mile, though the fear of discovery never fully left her. She kept her hood raised whenever they passed through small villages, her face turned away from curious glances, her identity guarded as carefully as the child growing within her. On the evening of the third day, the cart finally rolled into Millbrook, a modest village nestled between gentle hills and a wide, slow-moving river. Smoke curled from chimney tops, and the sound of evening chores, chickens being settled, wood being stacked, drifted through the cooling air. It was nothing like the grandeur of Castral Castle, and Elena found, to her surprise, that she preferred it immediately. Nora's sister, a warm, sturdy woman named Bethan, greeted Elena with a kindness that eased much of the tension she had carried throughout the journey. Bethan asked few questions, accepting the letter of introduction with a knowing nod, and ushering Elena into a small but comfortable cottage at the edge of the village, one that had, until recently, belonged to an elderly weaver who had passed away without family to claim it. "You will be safe here," Bethan told her, settling Elena into a chair by the modest hearth. "Millbrook keeps to itself. We do not concern ourselves with the affairs of kings and castles. You will need a new name, of course, something simple, something that draws no questions." Elena considered this for a long moment, thinking of the life she was leaving behind, the identity she had worn as queen, the name that had once been spoken with reverence in royal halls, and was now, likely, being spoken with scandal and speculation throughout Castral. Lena, she said finally. Just Lena. A widow, perhaps, come to start fresh after losing my husband to illness. Bethan nodded approvingly. A common enough story, she said. No one will think twice about it. Over the following weeks, Elena, now known simply as Lena throughout Millbrook, settled into a rhythm of life entirely different from anything she had known before. She learned to tend a small garden, to mend her own clothing, to barter fairly at the village market for the goods she could not grow or make herself. The villagers, curious at first about the quiet widow who had arrived carrying nothing but a satchel and a growing belly, gradually accepted her presence with the same easy warmth Bethan had shown from the start. Nora traveled to Millbrook once during those early weeks, checking on Elena's health and the progress of her pregnancy, with the same steady care she had shown back at the castle. The child grows well, Nora assured her, pressing gentle hands against Elena's rounded belly. Strong and healthy. You have done well, Lena, choosing this path for yourself and your child. Elena, sitting in the small kitchen of her new cottage, found herself smiling for the first time in what felt like months. It does not feel like courage most days, she admitted. It feels like fear, and exhaustion, and grief all tangled together. That is what courage often feels like, Nora said gently. The feeling does not have to be pleasant for the choice to be right. As the weeks passed, word of the royal wedding at Castral reached even the quiet corners of Millbrook, carried by traveling merchants and wandering minstrels who spoke of the upcoming union between King Damien and Princess Seraphine as though it were the event of the decade. Elena listened to these stories with a strange, distant ache. No longer anger exactly, but something quieter and sadder. A mourning for the life and love she had once believed in so completely. She learned that the wedding had proceeded as planned, a grand affair, meant to symbolize the newfound peace between Castral and Ashworth. She learned that the former queen's disappearance had become the subject of much speculation throughout both kingdoms, with theories ranging from tragic accident to deliberate flight, though none of the wandering storytellers seemed to know the true reason behind her absence. Elena kept these stories close, turning them over in her mind during the quiet hours of her pregnancy, feeling a complicated mixture of relief and sorrow with each new detail. Relief that her plan had succeeded, that she had built a life beyond the reach of Castral's politics. Sorrow that the man she had once loved so deeply was now bound to another woman, his kingdom's peace secured at the cost of a family he might never fully know. As her due date approached, Elena found herself thinking less of Damien and more of the child growing within her, the future she was building day by day in the quiet cottage at the edge of Millbrook. She began preparing a small nursery in the corner of her bedroom, sewing simple clothing with fabric purchased from the village market, arranging a modest wooden cradle that Bethan's husband had built for her without being asked, simply because it seemed the kind thing to do for a woman raising a child alone. On a cool evening in early autumn, as the leaves along the riverbank began to turn shades of amber and gold, Elena felt the first true pains of labor. Bethan arrived quickly, along with a local midwife known throughout Millbrook for her steady hands and calm presence, and together, they guided Elena through hours of difficult, exhausting labor that tested every ounce of strength she possessed. When the child finally arrived, well past midnight, his cries filling the small cottage with a sound so full of life that Elena wept openly for the first time since leaving Castral. She held him against her chest and studied his tiny face with a wonder that eclipsed every hardship of the previous months. "He is beautiful," Bethan whispered, helping to clean and swaddle the newborn. "What will you name him?" Elena looked down at her son, at the unmistakable strength already visible in his small features that carried unmistakable traces of his father's bloodline despite the humble circumstances of his birth. She thought of the wooden bird she still carried, the last remaining piece of a love that had once felt limitless, and of the future she intended to build for this child, one built on honesty and choice rather than duty and secrecy. "Ronan," she said finally. "His name is Ronan." Outside the small cottage, the autumn wind moved gently through the trees along the riverbank, carrying the sound of a newborn's cry out into the quiet Millbrook night, far beyond the reach of any castle wall, any royal announcement, any political alliance built on the ashes of a broken promise. Elena held her son close, feeling for the first time in months a sense of peace settle over her heart, uncertain of what the future held, but certain, finally, that whatever came next would be shaped by her own hands and her own choices, exactly as it should be. 4 years passed in Millbrook, each one folding quietly into the next, marked by the changing seasons rather than the shifting politics of a kingdom Elena had left behind. Ronan grew from a small, curious infant into a bright-eyed boy with dark hair and a steady, watchful gaze that reminded Elena, in quiet, unguarded moments, unmistakably of his father. He ran barefoot through the village lanes, chased chickens through Bethan's yard, and asked endless questions about the world, with a curiosity that Elena both delighted in and, at times, feared. "Where do rivers go, Mama?" he would ask, sitting at the edge of the water with his small feet dangling above the current. "Why do birds fly instead of walk? Why does old Godfrey at the mill have only one arm?" Elena answered each question with patience, weaving small lessons about the world into simple, honest explanations, careful never to lie to her son, even about difficult things. It was a promise she had made to herself in the earliest days of motherhood, that whatever else she withheld to protect him, she would never build his understanding of the world on falsehoods, the way she herself had once been deceived. She had built, in those 4 years, a modest but steady life. Her skill with a needle, sharpened out of necessity during her early days in Millbrook, had grown into a small but respected trade. Villagers came to her cottage for mending, for simple garments, for the occasional finely embroidered piece for a wedding or celebration. She was not wealthy, not by any measure that would have impressed the court she once belonged to, but she was independent, respected, and, most importantly, free to make her own choices without the weight of a crown pressing down upon her. Nora visited when she could, though the journey grew harder as the years passed and her own health began to slow her travels. On her most recent visit, she had brought with her, along with her usual careful check of Ronan's health and growth, news from Kestrel that she delivered with visible reluctance. "The kingdom speaks little of the former queen these days," Nora said, settling into the chair by Elena's hearth with a tired sigh. "Most have moved on to other gossip, but I thought you would want to know. The marriage between the king and Queen Seraphine has not been a happy one. The court whispers of two people bound by duty rather than affection, living increasingly separate lives within the same castle walls." Elena listened to this news with a complicated stillness, no longer the sharp ache of betrayal she had once carried, but something quieter, more distant, like an old wound that had healed crooked but no longer throbbed with each passing thought. "That is not something I take pleasure in hearing," Elena said honestly. "I do not wish unhappiness on anyone, even those who caused me pain." Nora studied her for a long moment. "You have grown, Lena," she said, using the name Elena had worn for 4 years now, the name that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection. "Grown into someone I do not think the old Queen of Kestrel would recognize." Elena smiled faintly, glancing toward the window, where Ronan could be seen chasing a wooden hoop down the village lane with a group of other children, his laughter carrying clearly through the crisp autumn air. "Perhaps that is for the best," she said. But the peace Elena had built for herself and her son was not without its quiet, persistent shadows. Though Millbrook remained largely untouched by the affairs of distant kingdoms, travelers occasionally passed through, merchants and wanderers carrying news and gossip from beyond the surrounding hills, and each new arrival carried with it a small, familiar spike of fear that Elena had never fully learned to ignore. It was on an unremarkable afternoon in late autumn, as Elena sat outside her cottage mending a torn cloak for one of the village elders, that the fear she had carried quietly for 4 years finally found its shape. A merchant caravan had arrived in Millbrook that morning, larger than the usual traders who passed through, carrying fine cloth and spices from the eastern trade routes that connected the smaller villages to the grander cities beyond. Elena had gone to the market that morning, as she often did, to see what new goods might be available, Ronan trotting along beside her, his small hand tucked into hers. Among the merchants stood a man Elena recognized instantly, though it took every ounce of her composure not to let her recognition show on her face. He had been a minor courtier at Kestrel Castle, a man who had attended several court functions during her brief time as queen, though she had never known him well. His name, she recalled after a moment of careful thought, was Edric, a merchant who had once supplied fine silks to the royal household before some falling out with the palace steward had sent him seeking business elsewhere. Edric's eyes moved across the market crowd, with the practiced assessment of a man used to sizing up potential customers, and for one heart-stopping moment, his gaze paused on Elena, a flicker of confusion crossing his features, before he turned his attention to a display of woven baskets nearby. Elena did not wait to see if the flicker of recognition would sharpen into certainty. She gathered Ronan close, murmuring a quiet excuse about needing to return home for an important task, and walked briskly back toward her cottage, her heart pounding with a fear she had not felt in years. "Mama, why are we walking so fast?" Ronan asked, his small legs struggling to keep pace with her hurried steps. "Just eager to get home, my love," Elena said, forcing a lightness into her voice that she did not feel. That evening, after Ronan had been tucked into bed, Elena sat alone by her hearth, turning the encounter over in her mind with growing unease. Perhaps Edric had not truly recognized her. 4 years had changed her, weathered her hands with honest work, thinned her face with the ordinary struggles of a life far removed from royal comfort. Perhaps the flicker of confusion on his face had meant nothing at all, but perhaps it had meant everything. She thought of Ronan, sleeping peacefully in the next room, unaware of the storm that might be gathering at the edges of the quiet life Elena had built for him. She thought of Damien, of Cassian's calculating presence at court, of the political machinery that had once decided her fate without her consent and could, if given the chance, decide it again. She did not sleep well that night, rising several times to check on Ronan, to peer out the small window of her cottage at the quiet, moonlit village beyond, searching for any sign of unusual movement, any indication that her carefully built anonymity had finally begun to crack. By morning, the merchant caravan had moved on, continuing their journey toward the larger towns further east, and Millbrook settled back into its familiar, unhurried rhythm. But Elena's unease did not fade so easily. She found herself watching the road into the village with new wariness in the weeks that followed, listening more carefully to the news carried by traveling merchants, questioning, quietly and carefully, whether the life she had built was truly as secure as she had allowed herself to believe. Meanwhile, at Kestrel Castle, the years had not been kind to the fragile peace purchased through Damien's marriage to Seraphine. The union, born entirely of political necessity, had settled into a cold, distant arrangement between two people who shared a throne but little else. Seraphine, for her part, had entered the marriage with clear eyes, understanding from the beginning that love was never part of the arrangement. But even she had not anticipated the particular loneliness of sharing a life with a man whose heart, she came to understand within the first year of their marriage, belonged entirely to someone else. "Damien, do you ever think of her?" Seraphine asked one evening, several years into their marriage, as they sat together at a formal dinner, attended by neither warmth nor genuine conversation, merely the practiced performance of a happy royal union for the benefit of watching courtiers. Damien did not need to ask who she meant. Every day, he admitted quietly, surprising himself with the honesty of the answer. Seraphine studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Do you know if she is safe?" Seraphine asked. "If the child was born healthy?" "I do not know," Damien said, and the admission carried a weight of grief he had carried silently for years, hidden behind the composed mask of a king who could not afford to show weakness in front of his court. "I searched, quietly, in the early months after she left. I found nothing. Eventually, I stopped searching, telling myself it was what she wanted, that pursuing her further would only cause more harm." "Perhaps you were right to stop," Seraphine said, though her tone carried little conviction. "Or perhaps you simply told yourself what was easiest to believe." Damien had no answer for that. It was a criticism he had leveled at himself countless times over the years, in the quiet hours after Seraphine had retired to her own separate chambers, in the moments when the crown felt less like an honor and more like a punishment for choices he had made too quickly, under pressure he had not fought hard enough against. Cassian, throughout these years, had continued his steady rise within the royal council, consolidating influence with a patience and precision that few at court fully appreciated. The alliance with Ashworth, secured through Damien and Seraphine's marriage, had brought the kingdom years of stability, and much of the credit for that stability had, subtly and deliberately, been directed toward Cassian's careful diplomatic maneuvering. Few questioned Cassian's growing power, distracted as they were by the more visible dramas of court life, the quiet tragedy of a loveless royal marriage, the persistent rumors of a lost queen and an unknown heir somewhere beyond the kingdom's borders. Cassian, for his part, encouraged these distractions whenever convenient, understanding that a court focused on romantic gossip was a court far less likely to scrutinize the careful, methodical expansion of his own influence over the kingdom's affairs. It was during a private council meeting, held late one evening with only Cassian's most trusted allies present, that the true depth of his ambitions began to surface, though carefully enough that even those in the room did not fully grasp the scope of what was being set into motion. The northern border reports continued to suggest Ashworth's forces were never as significant a threat as initially believed, one council member noted cautiously, reviewing old military assessments that had, for years, gone largely unquestioned. Some of these figures seem inflated compared to what our scouts have since confirmed. Cassian waved a dismissive hand. Old assessments from a tense period, he said smoothly. The threat was real enough at the time to warrant caution. The peace we have built since has proven the wisdom of that caution, regardless of how the initial figures compare to later, calmer analysis. The council member, satisfied by Cassian's confident explanation, did not press the matter further, and the conversation moved on to other affairs of state. But had anyone in that room looked closely enough at Cassian's expression in the candlelight, they might have noticed the faint, satisfied curve of his mouth, the quiet confirmation of a manipulation that had reshaped an entire kingdom's political future, and cost one woman everything she had once believed her life would become. Back in Millbrook, as autumn deepened into winter, Elena continued building her quiet life with her son, unaware of the conspiracy that had, years earlier, shaped the very circumstances that had driven her from Kestrel Castle in the first place. She taught Ronan his letters by the fire each evening, watched him grow stronger and more curious with each passing season, and told herself, with growing conviction, that whatever fears had been stirred by the merchant Edric's fleeting glance of recognition, her life in Millbrook remained safe, hidden, and entirely her own. But conspiracies, like winter frost, have a way of spreading quietly beneath the surface before their true damage becomes visible, and neither Elena in her quiet cottage nor Damien in his cold, dutiful marriage understood yet how close they stood to a reckoning that would, in time, unravel everything both of them had built in the years since that fateful announcement in the Kestrel throne room. Edric the merchant thought little of the woman in the Millbrook market for several weeks after his caravan moved on toward the eastern trade towns. Business kept him occupied, negotiating prices for silk and spice across a dozen small settlements, and the fleeting resemblance he had noticed faded into the background of a busy season. It was not until he found himself back in the capital city surrounding Kestrel Castle, delivering a shipment of fine cloth to a palace steward he had known for years, that the memory resurfaced. "Strange thing happened on my last circuit," Edric mentioned casually, as he and the steward shared a cup of wine after concluding their business. "Passed through a village called Millbrook, out past the eastern hills, saw a woman in the market who looked remarkably like our old queen, the one who disappeared before the king's wedding to Princess Seraphine. Had a young boy with her too, dark-haired, sharp-eyed. Struck me as odd, though I am sure it was nothing." The steward, a man named Percival who had served the royal household for over 2 decades, set down his cup slowly, his expression shifting from idle interest to careful attention. "You are certain of this?" Percival asked. "Certain enough to mention it," Edric said with a shrug, "though I could not say for certain it was truly her. It has been years after all. People's memories play tricks." Percival said little more on the matter that evening, but the seed of curiosity, once planted, proved difficult to ignore. As a longtime servant of the royal household, he understood better than most the significance such information could carry, both the potential reward for bringing it to the right ears, and the potential danger of speaking too loosely about a matter that touched the kingdom's most sensitive secrets. He debated for several days before finally deciding to approach Cassian directly, reasoning, with the practical calculation of a man who had survived decades of court politics, that the king's advisor would know best how to handle such delicate information. Cassian received the news in his private study, with an outward calm that betrayed nothing of the sharp calculation occurring behind his composed expression. "A village called Millbrook," he repeated, once Percival had finished relaying Edric's account. "And a young boy, dark-haired, resembling the king." That was the merchant's impression, Percival confirmed. though he stressed he could not be entirely certain. Cassian dismissed Percival with quiet thanks, and a small purse of coin for his discretion, then sat alone in his study long after the steward had departed, turning the information over carefully in his mind. If the former queen had indeed survived these past years, quietly raising a son who carried the unmistakable bloodline of King Damien, the implications for the kingdom's carefully constructed political stability were significant, and not, in Cassian's calculating assessment, entirely favorable to his own interests. The kingdom's peace, and Cassian's own considerable influence within it, rested on the foundation of Damien's marriage to Seraphine, an alliance that had brought years of stability and had allowed Cassian to consolidate power with minimal scrutiny. A legitimate heir born before that marriage, a son with clear royal bloodline, could complicate matters considerably, particularly if Damien's affection for the boy's mother remained as strong as court rumors suggested it had once been. Cassian considered his options carefully over the following days. He could suppress the information entirely, ensuring it never reached Damien's ears, preserving the current political arrangement without disruption. But such suppression carried its own risks, should the truth eventually surface through other channels, exposing Cassian's role in concealing it. Alternatively, he could use the information strategically, positioning himself as the one who uncovered the lost queen's whereabouts, earning the king's gratitude, while carefully managing how and when the reunion, if it occurred at all, might unfold. After much deliberation, Cassian settled on a third option, one that allowed him to gather more information, while maintaining full control over how, or if, the matter reached Damien's attention. He dispatched a trusted agent, a quiet, capable man named Fenwick, who had served Cassian on several delicate matters over the years, to travel to Millbrook under the guise of an ordinary traveler, to confirm the merchant's account and assess the situation before any decisions were made. Fenwick departed within the week, carrying instructions to observe carefully, ask no direct questions, and report back everything he learned, without alerting anyone in Millbrook to the true purpose of his visit. He arrived in the village on a cold, overcast afternoon in early winter, presenting himself as a traveling scholar interested in the region's local history, a cover story sufficiently mundane to avoid suspicion, while allowing him reasonable freedom to observe the village and its residents. He spent several days wandering the market, engaging local shopkeepers in idle conversation, and gradually piecing together information about the quiet widow known throughout Millbrook as Lena, who had arrived 4 years earlier, with nothing but a satchel and a growing belly, and who now supported herself and her young son through skilled needlework. Fenwick observed Elena from a careful distance on several occasions, noting her composed bearing, the careful way she carried herself despite the humble simplicity of her daily life, details that struck him as inconsistent with the ordinary widow stories circulating throughout the village. But it was the sight of her son, playing near the riverbank with a group of other village children one crisp afternoon, that confirmed for Fenwick beyond any reasonable doubt the truth of Edric's initial suspicion. The boy's features carried an unmistakable resemblance to King Damien, the same sharp jawline, the same intense, watchful eyes that Fenwick had observed countless times during royal court proceedings. There was no question in his mind, watching the boy run and laugh along the riverbank, that he was looking at the missing heir to the Kestrel throne. Fenwick departed Millbrook within the day, careful to avoid drawing any further attention, and made the journey back to Kestrel Castle with considerably more urgency than his outward journey had required. He delivered his findings to Cassian in a private meeting, describing in careful detail everything he had observed, the woman's composed bearing, the boy's unmistakable resemblance, the quiet, unremarkable life they had built together in the small village beyond the eastern hills. Cassian listened to the full report in silence, his mind already working through the various implications and possibilities the confirmed information presented. "This changes matters considerably," he said finally, once Fenwick had concluded his account. "You are certain of the resemblance?" "Beyond any doubt, my lord," Fenwick confirmed. "Anyone who has seen the king in person would recognize the likeness immediately." Cassian dismissed Fenwick with instructions to speak of the matter to absolutely no one, then sat alone in his study for the remainder of the evening, weighing his options with the careful precision that had defined his entire career within the royal court. The safest path, from a purely strategic standpoint, would be to ensure this information never reached Damien, to quietly monitor the situation in Millbrook while allowing the current political arrangement to remain undisturbed. But Cassian understood. with the calculating clarity that had served him well over the years, that secrets of this magnitude rarely remained buried forever, particularly when they involved a king's missing heir. Better, he reasoned, to control the reveal himself, to shape how and when the truth reached Damien, ensuring that whatever unfolded served Cassian's own carefully cultivated influence, rather than threatening it. He decided, after much careful thought, that a small, controlled revelation would serve his purposes best, enough information to draw Damien's attention and gratitude, while withholding enough detail to maintain Cassian's ongoing control over the situation as it developed. 3 days later, Cassian requested a private audience with the king, a meeting held behind closed doors with no other council members present. Damien, weary from another evening of the cold, dutiful performance that constituted his marriage to Seraphine, received the request with mild curiosity, unaware of the news that was about to upend the careful, if joyless, equilibrium he had settled into over the past several years. "Your Majesty," Cassian began, once the study door had been securely closed, "I bring you information that I believe warrants your immediate and discreet attention. Information regarding the former queen." Damien's entire posture shifted at the mention of Elena, a tension entering his shoulders that had not been present moments before. "Speak plainly, Cassian," he said, his voice carrying a sharpness that reflected years of suppressed longing finally straining against its careful containment. Cassian, watching the king's reaction with careful attention, proceeded with deliberate caution. "Reliable sources have confirmed that the former queen is alive," he said, "and living in a village to the east, under a different name. She has raised a son these past 4 years, a boy who, by all accounts, bears an unmistakable resemblance to your Majesty." The silence that followed stretched long and heavy, Damien standing utterly still, his expression a complicated mixture of disbelief, hope, and a grief so old and familiar, it had become nearly indistinguishable from the ordinary rhythm of his days. "A son," he finally said, the word barely more than a whisper. "I have a son." "It appears so, your Majesty," Cassian confirmed. Damien turned away, moving toward the window of his study, staring out over the kingdom he had sacrificed so much to protect, a kingdom that suddenly felt smaller and less significant than the news he had just received. 4 years, he said quietly. 4 years I have wondered, hoped, feared the worst. And she has been alive this entire time, raising our son without my knowledge. She made her choice to leave, your Majesty, Cassian said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of a man laying careful groundwork for whatever came next. Perhaps she made her choice to remain hidden as well. Damien did not respond immediately, his mind racing through years of grief and guilt, now colliding with a fresh, urgent need to see for himself the truth of what Cassian had revealed. "I must go to her," he said finally, turning back to face his advisor. "I must see them both, with my own eyes." Cassian had anticipated this response, and had, in fact, calculated it as the most likely outcome when he decided to share the information at all. "Of course, your Majesty," he said smoothly, "though I would advise considerable discretion. Queen Seraphine, the council, the broader court, none of them are yet aware of this development. A hasty public pursuit could create complications neither you nor the kingdom can currently afford." Damien barely registered the warning, his thoughts consumed entirely by the image of a son he had never met, a woman he had never stopped loving, despite the years and the distance, and the cold, dutiful marriage that had defined his life since her departure. "I will go quietly," he said, "alone, if necessary, but I will go." Cassian bowed his head in careful acknowledgement, already turning over in his mind the various ways this development might be shaped and managed to his own continued advantage. Whatever happened next, whether Damien's reunion with his lost family brought joy or fresh heartbreak, Cassian intended to ensure that the outcome, however it unfolded, ultimately strengthened rather than threatened the careful web of influence he had spent years constructing within the Kestrel court. As Damien began making quiet preparations for a journey he had never expected to take, a journey toward a truth that had remained hidden for 4 long years, neither he nor Elena, far away in the quiet village of Millbrook, understood yet how dramatically their lives were about to collide once again, or how the careful manipulations of a man neither of them fully trusted would continue shaping the course of events long after this particular reunion had run its course. Damien rode east alone, dressed in the plain clothing of an ordinary traveler, his royal insignia left behind at the castle, along with the crown that had, for years, felt more like a burden than an honor. He told Seraphine only that urgent matters required his attention beyond the kingdom's borders. A vague explanation she accepted with the same practiced indifference that had come to define their marriage. He told the council nothing at all, trusting only Cassian with the true purpose of his journey, a trust that, had Damien understood the full extent of his advisor's calculating ambitions, he might have reconsidered. The journey to Millbrook took 3 days, each mile carrying Damien further from the familiar weight of his crown, and closer to a reckoning he had both dreaded and longed for, since the morning he discovered Elena's chamber, empty 4 years earlier. He thought, throughout the long hours on the road, of everything he might say to her, every apology, every explanation, every plea for forgiveness that had run through his mind countless times over the years without ever finding an audience. None of the words felt adequate. None of them felt capable of undoing 4 years of separation, of a childhood already half-lived without his presence. He arrived in Millbrook on a cold, clear afternoon, the village quiet and unremarkable beneath a pale winter sun. He found Elena's cottage easily enough, following the directions Fenwick had provided, and stood for a long moment outside the modest wooden door, his heart pounding with an intensity he had not experienced since the earliest days of his courtship with the woman who waited somewhere beyond it. He knocked before he could allow doubt to overtake his resolve. The door opened, and Elena stood before him, older now, weathered by years of honest work and quiet resilience, but unmistakably herself, the same steady eyes, the same composed strength that had first drawn him to her at that village gathering in Thornhollow so many years ago. Her expression shifted rapidly from confusion to shock to something far more complicated, as recognition settled fully over her features. "Damien," she breathed, the name carrying 4 years of unspoken grief and anger, in a single, barely audible word. "Elena," he said, and found that despite every carefully rehearsed word from his journey east, he could summon nothing more than her name in response. They stood facing each other in the cottage doorway for a long, suspended moment, neither moving, neither speaking, the weight of everything unsaid between them, pressing down with an intensity that made the cold winter air feel almost secondary. It was the sound of small footsteps approaching from inside the cottage that finally broke the silence. "Mama, who is it?" Ronan asked, appearing beside Elena and peering curiously up at the stranger standing in their doorway. Damien felt the breath leave his body entirely as he looked down at his son for the first time, at the dark hair and sharp, watchful eyes that mirrored his own so closely it felt like looking into a reflection of his own childhood. Ronan stared back at him with open, unguarded curiosity, utterly unaware of the significance of the moment unfolding before him. Elena moved instinctively, placing a protective hand on Ronan's shoulder, positioning herself slightly between her son and the man who had once promised her a future that never materialized. "Go inside, sweetheart," she said gently, her voice carefully controlled despite the visible tremor beneath its surface. "I need to speak with this visitor for a moment." Ronan, sensing the tension in his mother's voice, retreated back into the cottage without further protest, though he cast one more curious glance over his shoulder at the stranger before disappearing from view. Elena stepped outside, pulling the door mostly closed behind her, and faced Damien with an expression that had hardened considerably since the brief moment of shocked recognition that had greeted his arrival. "How did you find us?" she asked, her voice low and tight with barely controlled anger. "A merchant recognized you in the market," Damien said honestly, unwilling to begin this reunion with anything less than the full truth, regardless of how uncomfortable it might prove. Cassian's people confirmed it. Elena's jaw tightened at the mention of Cassian's name. "Of course," she said bitterly. "Even now, even after everything, that man's hands find their way into my life." "I am sorry," Damien said, "for all of it. The wedding, the secrecy, everything that drove you away from a home that should have protected you, instead of forcing you to flee it." Elena studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, years of careful composure allowing her to mask whatever storm of emotion churned beneath the surface. "You are 4 years too late for apologies," she said finally. "Ronan has grown up without a father. I built a life here, alone, while you sat comfortably on your throne beside your queen." "Comfortably," Damien repeated, a bitter edge entering his own voice for the first time. Elena, there has been nothing comfortable about the past 4 years. My marriage to Seraphine is a cold, hollow arrangement neither of us ever wanted. I have spent every day since your departure wondering if you were safe, if our child had been born healthy, if you thought of me at all in whatever life you had built without me. I thought of you often, Elena admitted, the anger in her voice softening slightly, replaced by something more complicated. But thinking of you and forgiving you are not the same thing, Damien. You had a choice, that day in the throne room, and you chose your crown. I cannot pretend that choice did not shape everything that came after. Damien nodded slowly, accepting the truth of her words without argument. I did choose my crown, he said, and I have regretted it every single day since. But I am here now, Elena, not as a king pursuing his heir for political convenience, but as a man who never stopped loving you, who wants, more than anything, the chance to know his son, and to make right what he broke all those years ago. Elena wrapped her arms around herself against the cold winter air, or perhaps against the weight of the conversation itself, her gaze drifting toward the closed cottage door behind which Ronan waited, blissfully unaware of the complicated history unfolding just beyond his reach. What exactly are you asking of me? Elena said finally. To return to Kestrel. To become, what? A secret mistress tucked quietly away while you continue your marriage to Seraphine. I will not accept that life, Damien. Not for myself, and certainly not for my son. I am not asking that, Damien said firmly. I do not yet know what the right path forward looks like. My marriage to Seraphine was built on political necessity, not love, and it has brought neither of us happiness these past years. But I cannot simply dissolve it without consequence, without risking the very peace it was meant to secure. I need time to consider how to move forward honorably, for everyone involved, including you and Ronan. Elena's expression hardened further at this response. So once again, she said, your kingdom's needs come before mine, before ours. That is not fair, Damien said, though even as he spoke the words, he heard the hollow echo of every similar protest he had made 4 years earlier, in the throne room, in her chamber, in every desperate attempt to explain choices that had, ultimately, prioritized his crown over his family. Elena said nothing for a long moment, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond Damien, toward the quiet, snow-dusted hills surrounding Millbrook, the life she had built here, humble, but entirely her own. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weary resignation that struck Damien more deeply than her earlier anger had. I do not know what is fair anymore, she said. I only know that I built this life to protect my son from exactly this kind of uncertainty, this constant weighing of duty against family, kingdom against love. I will not undo that protection easily, Damien, not even for you. Can I at least meet him properly? Damien asked, his voice softening with a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show, even in private. Can I know my son, Elena, even if you and I cannot find our way back to what we once had? Elena considered this request for a long, silent moment, weighing the fierce protective instinct that had guided every decision she had made since fleeing Kestrel 4 years earlier, against the quieter, more complicated truth that Ronan deserved, on some level, the chance to know his father, regardless of the complicated circumstances surrounding his birth. He does not know who you are, she said finally. He believes his father died before he was born. I will not shatter that belief carelessly, not until I am certain what role you truly intend to play in his life going forward. That is fair, Damien said quietly. Whatever time you need, whatever conditions you require, I will respect them. Elena studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of the careful political calculation that had shaped so many of his previous decisions, and found, to her cautious surprise, something that looked genuinely like humility, like a man finally reckoning honestly with the consequences of choices he had made too quickly, years earlier, under pressure he had not fought hard enough to resist. You may stay in the village for a few days, she said finally, though not in my home. Bethan has a spare room she rents to travelers. I will allow you to meet Ronan, gradually, as a family friend for now, nothing more, until I am certain what this means for all of us. Thank you, Damien said, the gratitude in his voice unmistakable and entirely sincere. Do not thank me yet, Elena said, her expression still guarded despite the small concession she had offered. This does not undo 4 years, Damien. It does not erase what happened in that throne room, or the humiliation of learning about your engagement from palace servants instead of from you directly. Whatever comes next, we will move slowly, carefully, and always with Ronan's well-being placed above everything else. I understand, Damien said. And I agree completely. Elena nodded once, then turned back toward her cottage door, pausing before opening it to look back at him one final time. I never stopped loving the man I married in Thornhollow, she admitted quietly, the confession clearly costing her considerable effort. But that man made a choice, in the throne room, that broke something between us. Something I am not certain can ever be fully repaired, regardless of how much time we spend rebuilding it now. Then let me try, Damien said. Please, Elena. Let me try to earn back what I lost. Elena held his gaze for a long moment, years of hurt and longing and cautious hope all warring visibly behind her careful composure, before finally nodding once more and disappearing back into the cottage, leaving Damien standing alone in the cold winter afternoon, facing the uncertain, complicated path that stretched out ahead of him, toward a family he had only just discovered, and a reconciliation that remained, for now, entirely uncertain. Over the following days, Damien visited Millbrook cautiously, careful to respect the boundaries Elena had established. He met Ronan gradually, introduced as a traveling friend of the family, watching with quiet, aching wonder as his son's natural curiosity gradually warmed into genuine interest and eventually, tentative friendship. He learned about Ronan's fascination with rivers and birds, his stubborn insistence on tying his own boots despite frequent frustration, his surprisingly gentle patience with the younger village children despite his own boundless energy. Elena watched these interactions with careful, guarded attention, noting with quiet relief that Damien showed no signs of the impatience or entitlement she had half feared might surface, no attempt to rush the careful boundaries she had established, or to assert authority over a son who had grown up entirely without him. Instead, he showed patience, genuine interest, and a humility that gradually, slowly, began to soften some of the hardened protective walls Elena had built around her heart over the past 4 years. But even as this fragile, cautious reconnection began to take shape in the quiet village of Millbrook, far away at Castral Castle, Cassian continued working carefully behind the scenes, monitoring the situation through regular reports from Fenwick, already calculating how this unexpected development might be shaped to serve his own continued influence over the kingdom's future, regardless of what outcome Damien and Elena ultimately reached regarding their complicated, unresolved history. Damien remained in Millbrook for nearly 2 weeks, far longer than the vague excuse of urgent matters could reasonably justify, and by the time he finally rode back toward Castral Castle, he understood that the careful fiction he had offered Seraphine before his departure would no longer hold beneath even mild scrutiny. He spent much of the return journey rehearsing explanations, discarding each one as either insufficient or needlessly cruel, until he finally settled on the only approach that felt honest enough to offer his wife, however complicated their marriage had become over the years. Seraphine received him in her private sitting room upon his return, her expression carefully composed in the practiced manner of a woman who had learned, over years of political marriage, to guard her true feelings behind a mask of polite indifference. 2 weeks is a considerable absence for urgent matters left unspecified, she observed, not looking up from the correspondence she had been reviewing when he entered. Damien closed the door behind him, understanding that whatever conversation followed deserved privacy, rather than the watchful ears of passing servants. I owe you the truth, he said. I have owed it to you for longer than I care to admit. Seraphine finally looked up, something sharpening in her expression at the seriousness of his tone. Then tell it, she said simply. Damien told her everything, the merchant's chance recognition, Cassian's careful investigation, the journey to Millbrook, the discovery of a son he had never known existed. He watched Seraphine's face throughout the account, searching for anger, for hurt, for any of the emotions he had braced himself to encounter, but found instead a complicated stillness that revealed little of what she truly felt. When he finished, Seraphine set down her correspondence entirely and rose from her chair, moving to the window that overlooked the castle grounds below, her back turned to him for a long, silent moment. A son, she finally said, her voice carefully neutral. And Elena, alive this entire time, hidden away in some village, While you and I have spent these past years building a marriage neither of us truly wanted. I am sorry, Damien said, the apology feeling inadequate even as he offered it. Seraphine turned back to face him, and to his surprise, her expression carried not the anger he had expected, but something closer to weary relief. Do not apologize to me for this, Damien, she said. I entered this marriage with clear eyes, understanding exactly what it was and was not. I never expected your heart, only your respect and your honesty as a political partner. The fact that you have now offered me both, however delayed, is more than many women in my position ever receive. Damien studied his wife carefully, seeing her, perhaps for the first time in years, as a fully realized person, rather than simply the political arrangement their marriage had come to represent. What do you want, Seraphine? He asked. Truly, not what duty requires of you, but what you actually want, for your own life. Seraphine considered the question for a long moment, an unusual vulnerability crossing her features before she carefully composed herself once more. I want, she said slowly, a life that is honestly my own, rather than one shaped entirely around the needs of a kingdom, and a husband who never chose me freely. I do not know if that is possible within the constraints of our current arrangement, but I find, hearing your news today, that I am not entirely opposed to exploring what alternatives might exist. Are you suggesting we consider ending our marriage? Damien asked carefully. I am suggesting, Seraphine said, that neither of us has ever been genuinely happy in this arrangement, and that perhaps, now that circumstances have shifted so significantly, it may be time to honestly examine whether preserving this marriage still serves the purpose it was originally created for, or whether it has simply become a comfortable prison for us both. Damien absorbed her words carefully, understanding the weight of what she was proposing, the political complications any dissolution of their marriage would inevitably create, particularly given the delicate peace it had helped secure between Castral and Ashworth. Such a decision cannot be made hastily, he said. The alliance between our kingdoms remains important, regardless of our personal feelings. I understand that fully, Seraphine said. I am not suggesting we act rashly. Only that we begin, honestly, to consider what paths forward might actually serve both our happiness and our kingdom's continued stability, rather than simply enduring an arrangement that has brought neither of us genuine fulfillment. Their conversation continued late into the evening, careful and measured, both of them navigating unfamiliar territory as they began, for the first time since their wedding, to speak honestly with each other about the true nature of their marriage and the complicated futures that now stretched ahead of them both. Meanwhile, within the quieter corridors of the royal council chambers, a separate and equally significant reckoning had begun to take shape, one that neither Damien nor Seraphine yet fully understood the implications of. Lord Aldrich, a senior council member who had served the Castral throne for over 3 decades, had recently been tasked with reviewing the kingdom's military archives as part of a routine assessment of border defenses, a task that had, quite unexpectedly, led him toward a series of troubling discrepancies. Aldrich had spent several careful weeks cross-referencing the military assessments from the period preceding Damien's marriage to Seraphine, the reports that had documented Ashworth's supposed troop movements along the northern border, the intelligence that had prompted the urgent political alliance in the first place. What he found, buried within old dispatches and scout reports that had gone largely unexamined in the years since, troubled him considerably. The initial reports of Ashworth's military buildup, submitted by scouts under Cassian's direct authority, described troop numbers and fortification efforts significantly higher than what subsequent, independent assessments from the same period actually confirmed. Aldrich found correspondence from Border Patrol captains describing considerably smaller and less aggressive movements than the alarming figures that had ultimately reached the Royal Council and prompted the urgent marriage negotiations with Ashworth. Aldrich brought his concerns first to a trusted colleague, Lord Bertram, a fellow council member known for his careful, methodical approach to matters of state. The two men reviewed the discrepancies together over several private meetings, growing increasingly troubled by what appeared to be a deliberate inflation of the threat that had, years earlier, justified an alliance built on a political marriage that had brought considerable personal cost to at least 2 people within the royal family. Someone exaggerated these reports, Bertram said grimly, during one of their private late-night meetings, reviewing the collected evidence spread across Aldrich's private study table. Deliberately, and with considerable care to avoid detection. The question is who, and why. The reports all originated from scouts operating under Cassian's direct authority, Aldrich observed carefully. I do not make this accusation lightly, Bertram, given the man's considerable influence and standing within the court. But the pattern here is difficult to explain through simple error or coincidence. Bertram considered this carefully, understanding the significant risk involved in pursuing such an accusation against a man as powerful and carefully positioned as Cassian had become over the years. If you are right, he said slowly, then the king's marriage to Queen Seraphine, and everything that followed from it, including whatever happened to cause the former queen's disappearance, may have been built upon a deliberately manufactured threat rather than a genuine crisis. That is precisely my concern, Aldrich said grimly, and if that proves true, the implications extend far beyond simple political embarrassment. We would be looking at a systematic manipulation of the crown itself, orchestrated for reasons we do not yet fully understand. The two men agreed, after much careful deliberation, to continue their investigation quietly, gathering additional evidence before bringing their concerns to the king directly, understanding that an accusation of this magnitude, leveled against Cassian, without ironclad proof, could easily backfire and cost them both their positions, or worse, should Cassian's influence prove strong enough to deflect and discredit their findings. Neither Aldrich nor Bertram yet understood how closely their careful investigation would eventually intersect with the personal reckoning already unfolding between Damien, Seraphine, and Elena, nor how the revelation of Cassian's manipulation would ultimately unravel far more than a single set of falsified military reports, threatening instead the entire foundation upon which the kingdom's fragile peace had been built. As winter deepened over Kestrel, three separate threads of consequence: Damien's rediscovered family in Millbrook, the increasingly honest reckoning between him and Seraphine, and the quiet, methodical investigation into Cassian's years-old manipulation, continued moving steadily toward a convergence that none of the involved parties yet fully anticipated, each thread pulling the kingdom closer to a reckoning that would, in time, reshape the entire royal court and everyone connected to it. Spring arrived in Millbrook with its usual gentle unfolding, snow melting from the surrounding hills, the river running fuller and faster along its familiar banks, and Damien, over the following months, found himself making the 3-day journey east with increasing frequency, each visit carefully arranged around his duties at Kestrel Castle, each one bringing him closer to the fragile, careful trust that Elena had begun, cautiously, to extend toward him once again. He learned to navigate Millbrook's quiet rhythms during these visits, arriving under the same modest traveler's guise he had first adopted, staying always at Bethan's guest house rather than presuming any claim on Elena's cottage or her carefully guarded independence. He brought no royal gifts, no lavish displays of wealth that might have drawn unwanted attention or disrupted the humble life Elena had built for herself and Ronan. Instead, he brought small, thoughtful offerings: a book of stories for Ronan, seeds for Elena's garden, simple gestures that spoke more clearly of genuine care than any grand royal display ever could have. Ronan, for his part, had grown increasingly attached to the frequent visitor his mother introduced simply as a family friend, following Damien eagerly during his visits, peppering him with the same endless stream of questions he directed at everyone in his young life. Questions about horses, about the wider world beyond Millbrook, about whether the visitor had ever seen a real castle. "I have seen a few," Damien admitted carefully during one such conversation, seated beside Ronan on the riverbank on a warm spring afternoon, watching the boy skip stones across the water's calm surface. "They are less magical than the stories make them sound. Mostly cold stone and long hallways, and people who spend far too much time arguing about things that matter far less than they believe." "That sounds boring," Ronan declared with the blunt honesty of a child unburdened by court diplomacy. Damien laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that had grown increasingly rare within the walls of Kestrel Castle over the years. "It can be, quite often," he agreed. "I would rather spend my afternoons skipping stones with you than sitting through most council meetings, if I am honest." Elena, watching this exchange from a short distance away where she sat mending a torn shirt, felt something in her chest loosen slightly, a knot of protective fear that had tightened around her heart for 4 years finally beginning, cautiously, to ease. She had watched Damien carefully during each of his visits, searching for any sign of the entitled impatience or careless disregard she had feared might eventually surface, and had found instead, consistently, a patience and genuine warmth that gradually chipped away at the walls she had so carefully constructed. That evening, after Ronan had been settled into bed, Elena and Damien sat together outside her cottage, the warm spring air carrying the scent of blooming wildflowers from the surrounding hills. "It has been 6 months since you first arrived in Millbrook," Elena observed quietly. "And in that time, I find that my anger, though it has not disappeared entirely, has softened into something I did not expect to feel toward you again." Damien looked at her carefully, hope and caution warring visibly in his expression. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I mean," Elena said slowly, choosing her words with the same careful precision she brought to every important decision in her life, "that I see now, more clearly than I did 6 months ago, a man genuinely trying to make amends, rather than a king simply seeking to reclaim what he considers rightfully his. That distinction matters to me, Damien. It matters a great deal." Damien felt something in his chest tighten with cautious hope. "Does that mean," he began carefully, uncertain how to phrase the question that had lingered unspoken between them for months. "It means," Elena said, cutting gently through his uncertainty, "that I am willing to consider what a future together might look like, though I will not rush that consideration, and I will not compromise Ronan's stability or well-being for the sake of moving faster than feels right. Whatever happens between us, my son remains my first priority, always. I would not want it any other way," Damien said honestly. "And I understand, Elena, that whatever trust we rebuild will take considerable time, and will require me to prove, consistently, that my actions match my words, in a way I failed to do 4 years ago." They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while after that, watching the stars emerge slowly over the quiet hills surrounding Millbrook, neither of them rushing to fill the silence with further words, both simply allowing the fragile, cautious progress of the evening to settle naturally between them. But even as this careful reconciliation continued unfolding in the quiet corners of Millbrook, far away at Kestrel Castle, the investigation led by Lord Aldrich and Lord Bertram had continued its methodical progress, gathering increasingly troubling evidence of Cassian's years-old manipulation of the military reports that had originally justified Damien's marriage to Seraphine. The two lords had, over recent weeks, tracked down a retired border scout named Corwin, a man who had served along the northern frontier during the original crisis period, and who had, upon careful and discreet questioning, confirmed troubling details that further corroborated their growing suspicions. "I remember those months clearly," Corwin told them, during a careful private meeting arranged at a secluded tavern well away from the prying eyes of the castle. "Ashworth's forces were present along the border, yes, but nothing like the numbers that eventually reached the Royal Council. I filed my own reports at the time, honest assessments, but they never seemed to influence the final picture presented to the king. Someone above my position was clearly adjusting the figures before they reached the throne room." "Would you be willing to testify to this, formally, before the council?" Aldrich asked carefully, understanding the risk such testimony would carry, for a man who had, until now, lived a quiet, unremarkable retirement, far from the dangerous currents of royal politics. Corwin considered the question for a long, uncomfortable moment. "If it comes to that," he said finally, "and if you can guarantee my safety throughout the process, then yes. I did not spend years serving this kingdom honestly, only to watch its throne be manipulated by ambitious court officials without consequence." Aldrich and Bertram thanked Corwin for his courage and departed the meeting with a renewed sense of urgency, understanding that they now possessed enough evidence to bring their concerns directly to the king, rather than continuing their cautious private investigation indefinitely. But their careful discretion, however well maintained, had not gone entirely unnoticed. Cassian, whose network of informants extended throughout every level of Kestrel's court and military structure, had begun receiving troubling reports of his own in recent weeks. Whispers of council members making unusual inquiries into old military archives, of a retired border scout being sought out for private questioning, of a pattern of investigation that, if allowed to continue unchecked, threatened to expose the carefully constructed foundation upon which Cassian had built years of steadily increasing influence. Cassian received the most recent and detailed of these reports from Fenwick, who had, in addition to his ongoing surveillance of the situation in Millbrook, maintained careful watch over the political currents within the castle itself. Lord Aldrich and Lord Bertram have met with a retired scout named Corwin on 3 separate occasions over the past month, Fenwick reported, standing before Cassian in the privacy of his study. Their meetings have been conducted with considerable discretion, but my sources within the tavern staff confirmed the general nature of their discussions. Old military reports, discrepancies in troop assessments, matters relating to the period before the king's marriage to Queen Seraphine. Cassian absorbed this information with outward calm, though internally, a cold, calculating urgency had begun to take shape. This is precisely the kind of investigation that could unravel everything I have carefully built these past years, he said, more to himself than to Fenwick. If Aldrich and Bertram succeed in proving deliberate manipulation of those military reports, the consequences extend far beyond simple embarrassment. It would call into question the very legitimacy of the king's marriage to Seraphine, the peace it secured, and my own role in shaping the kingdom's response to that manufactured crisis. What would you have me do, my lord? Fenwick asked. Cassian considered the question carefully, weighing his options with the same methodical precision that had guided his rise to influence over the years. For now, continue monitoring their movements closely, he said finally. I need to understand the full scope of what they have uncovered before deciding how best to respond. But make no mistake, Fenwick, if this investigation continues unchecked, drastic measures may become necessary to protect the stability I have spent years carefully constructing. Fenwick bowed and departed to continue his surveillance, leaving Cassian alone in his study, the candlelight flickering across features that had, for the first time in years, begun to show genuine strain beneath their usual composed mask. Cassian understood, with growing unease, that the careful web of manipulation he had spun years earlier, the inflated threat reports, the forced marriage between Damien and Seraphine, the quiet suppression of information regarding Elena's whereabouts, had begun, slowly but unmistakably, to unravel. And as he sat alone in the quiet of his study that evening, contemplating the increasingly narrow range of options available to protect his years of careful influence, Cassian began to consider measures far more drastic than simple surveillance and information control, measures that would, in time, prove to be the very actions that finally brought his entire carefully constructed deception crashing down around him. Seraphine had grown, over recent months, into the habit of traveling regularly to a small chapel just beyond the castle grounds, a quiet retreat, where she found a measure of peace, increasingly difficult to locate, within the walls of Kestrel Castle itself. Her conversations with Damien regarding the future of their marriage had continued, careful and honest, both of them slowly working toward an understanding that would, they hoped, allow each of them the possibility of genuine happiness without unraveling the fragile peace their union had originally secured. It was during one of these routine journeys, on a mild evening in late spring, that the carefully constructed stability Cassian had spent years protecting finally began to fracture beyond his ability to contain it. Seraphine's carriage, accompanied by its usual modest guard of 4 soldiers, had traveled barely half the distance toward the chapel, when a group of armed men emerged suddenly from the tree line, along the quiet forest road, moving with a coordinated precision that immediately marked them as something far more organized than common bandits. The Queen's guards responded swiftly, though they were significantly outnumbered, and a fierce, chaotic struggle erupted along the narrow forest road, as the attackers pressed toward the carriage with clear, deliberate purpose. Seraphine, alerted by the sudden commotion, pressed herself low within the carriage compartment, her heart pounding as the sounds of combat grew closer. The battle might have ended in tragedy had it not been for the fortunate arrival of a separate patrol, led by a young captain named Griffin, who had been conducting routine border checks along a nearby stretch of the same forest road. Hearing the commotion, Griffin's patrol arrived swiftly, tipping the balance of the fight decisively in the Queen's favor. Within minutes, the attacking force had been either killed or captured, their assault thwarted, before it could reach its intended, deadly conclusion. Seraphine emerged from the carriage shaken but unharmed, her guards having sustained injuries but, remarkably, no fatalities among their number. One of the attackers, badly wounded but alive, had been captured and was brought immediately back to Kestrel Castle under heavy guard, along with the bodies of his fallen companions, for careful investigation into the identity and motives behind the coordinated assault. News of the attack spread quickly through the castle, reaching Damien within the hour, and he abandoned whatever business had occupied him that evening to rush immediately to Seraphine's side, his relief at finding her physically unharmed, tempered by a growing cold fury at whoever had orchestrated the assault. Who would dare, he demanded, standing over the captured, wounded attacker who had been secured within the castle's interrogation chambers, guarded closely by soldiers loyal directly to the crown rather than any single council member. The attacker, a hardened mercenary named Rurik, remained silent for the first several hours of questioning. His wounds tended just enough to keep him alive and coherent for interrogation. His loyalty to whoever had hired him, apparently strong enough to withstand considerable pressure. It was Lord Aldrich, arriving at the castle upon hearing news of the attack, who finally suggested an approach that ultimately broke through Rurik's stubborn silence. Rather than continued threats or physical pressure, Aldrich proposed offering the wounded mercenary a genuine path toward leniency, in exchange for full, honest testimony regarding who had commissioned the attack and why. Rurik, weighing his dwindling options carefully, finally spoke, his voice weak from blood loss, but his words carrying a weight that would soon shake the entire foundation of Kestral's royal court. "We were hired through an intermediary," he admitted. "Never met the man who commissioned us directly, but the payment came through channels connected to Lord Cassian's household. We were told the target needed to appear as though killed by Ashworth agents, to reignite tensions along the border and remind the kingdom why the current alliance remained necessary." The interrogation chamber fell into stunned silence at this revelation. Damien felt something cold settle over him, a dawning, horrified understanding of the depths to which his most trusted advisor had apparently sunk to protect whatever secrets he had been guarding. "You are certain of this?" Damien demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "As certain as a dying man can be about the source of his payment," Rurik said grimly, his strength visibly fading. "I have no reason left to lie, Your Majesty. My wounds will likely claim me, regardless of whatever mercy you choose to extend." Aldrich, standing nearby, exchanged a meaningful glance with Damien, understanding that the moment had finally arrived to reveal the full scope of the investigation he and Bertram had conducted over recent months. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "this revelation aligns disturbingly with concerns Lord Bertram and I have been investigating privately for some time now. Concerns regarding the original military reports that justified your marriage to Queen Seraphine." "Speak plainly, Aldrich," Damien said, his patience for careful diplomatic phrasing entirely exhausted by the events of the evening. Aldrich laid out the full scope of the investigation, the discrepancies uncovered in the old military archives, the testimony gathered from the retired scout Corwin, the mounting evidence that Cassian had, years earlier, deliberately inflated the threat posed by Ashworth's forces to manufacture a crisis that justified the political marriage he had so strongly advocated for. Damien listened to the full account with a growing cold fury that gradually replaced his earlier shock. "If this is true," he said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "then Cassian did not simply advise me poorly regarding a genuine crisis. He manufactured that crisis entirely, manipulating me into a marriage that drove Elena from this castle, that cost my son 4 years without his father, that has now apparently escalated to an attempted murder of my own wife, in order to protect his years of careful deception." "That appears to be precisely the case, Your Majesty," Aldrich said grimly. Damien's mind raced through the full implications of this revelation, years of guilt and regret regarding his choices, reshaping themselves entirely around a new, damning understanding. He had not simply chosen his crown over Elena in a moment of genuine, unavoidable necessity. He had been deliberately manipulated into that choice by a trusted advisor, pursuing his own carefully hidden ambitions, an advisor who had, this very evening, apparently ordered an attack that could easily have claimed Seraphine's life to protect that manipulation from finally coming to light. "Where is Cassian now?" Damien demanded. He was informed of the attack shortly after it occurred, and offered to personally oversee the investigation into the identity of the attackers, a nearby guard reported cautiously. Damien felt a fresh wave of cold fury at this information, understanding immediately the dangerous position such an offer represented. He intended to control the investigation into his own crime, he said grimly. "Find him, now, quietly, before he has any opportunity to destroy further evidence or flee the kingdom entirely." The guards dispatched to locate Cassian, returned within the hour with troubling news. The advisor had, in the brief window since the attack's failure became apparent, already departed his chambers, his most valuable possessions and documents conspicuously absent, along with several of his most trusted personal guards. "He has fled," Aldrich said grimly, upon receiving this report, which only further confirms his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Damien stood in the center of the castle's great hall, surrounded by council members and guards who had gathered upon hearing news of the unfolding crisis, the full weight of years of manipulation and deception finally crashing down around him with a clarity that felt almost physically painful. Seraphine, recovering from her own harrowing evening, joined him within the hall, her expression carrying a complicated mixture of shock, anger, and grim vindication at finally understanding the true nature of the events that had shaped her marriage from its very beginning. "He built our entire political alliance on a manufactured lie," Seraphine said quietly, standing beside Damien as the full council began assembling to address the unfolding crisis. "My marriage to you, Elena's exile, 4 years of a child growing up without his father, all of it rooted in Cassian's ambition rather than any genuine threat from Ashworth." "It appears so," Damien said grimly, and tonight, when his careful deception finally began unraveling, he chose to protect it through attempted murder, rather than accept the consequences of his manipulation being exposed. The council chamber filled quickly, as word of the crisis spread throughout the castle, senior lords and military commanders gathering to address a situation that threatened not only the immediate question of Cassian's whereabouts and eventual capture, but the far larger, more destabilizing question of what the kingdom's carefully maintained peace with Ashworth had actually been built upon, and what consequences might follow now that the manufactured foundation of that peace had been so dramatically exposed. As dawn broke over Castral Castle, the full scope of the crisis had become clear to everyone within its walls. Cassian, the trusted advisor who had shaped the kingdom's political direction for years, had vanished into the night, leaving behind a trail of manipulation and deception that stretched back years, touching every significant decision that had shaped Damien's reign, Seraphine's marriage, and Elena's painful exile from the life she had once believed would be hers forever. The reckoning that Aldrich and Bertram's careful investigation had been building toward for months had finally arrived, not through the measured, controlled process they had originally envisioned, but through the chaos and violence of a failed assassination attempt that had exposed Cassian's guilt beyond any possibility of denial or deflection. And as the kingdom began grappling with the full implications of this revelation, Damien understood, with a clarity that felt both liberating and devastating, that everything he had believed about the choices that shaped his life over the past 4 years now required complete and painful re-examination. The weeks following Cassian's disappearance transformed Kestrel Castle into a place of constant, anxious motion, council meetings stretching late into the night, messengers riding out in every direction, seeking any trace of the fugitive advisor, and an undercurrent of uncertainty spreading steadily through every level of the kingdom's governing structure. Damien, who had spent years trusting Cassian's counsel above nearly every other voice within his court, now found himself questioning the foundation of almost every significant decision he had made since taking the throne. The search for Cassian yielded results within the fortnight, though not the clean resolution many within the castle had hoped for. A patrol tracking his movements toward the eastern border finally caught up with his small group of loyal guards in a remote mountain pass, and in the resulting confrontation, Cassian was killed attempting to resist capture, taking with him to his death whatever additional secrets he might have revealed under formal questioning. His death, rather than closing the matter, left the kingdom grappling with unanswered questions and a growing sense that the full scope of his manipulation might never be entirely understood. Aldrich and Bertram continued their investigation in the weeks that followed, uncovering additional evidence of Cassian's years-long consolidation of influence, financial records suggesting he had profited considerably from the political instability his manipulation had created, correspondence hinting at ambitions that extended far beyond simply securing the Ashworth alliance, ambitions that some within the council speculated might have eventually targeted the throne itself. The revelation that the entire foundation of Damien's marriage to Seraphine had been built upon a manufactured crisis sent shockwaves far beyond the walls of Castral Castle. Word reached Ashworth's royal court within days, carried by diplomats who could no longer avoid addressing the uncomfortable truth that the alliance between the two kingdoms had been forged not through genuine mutual threat, but through the calculated ambition of a single, now deceased advisor. Ashworth's king, understandably troubled by the revelation, demanded urgent clarification regarding the true state of relations between the two kingdoms, uncertain whether the peace they had maintained for years rested on any genuine foundation or had simply been a convenient fiction that Cassian had exploited for his own purposes. Damien, already exhausted by the domestic crisis unfolding within his own court, found himself forced to divert considerable diplomatic effort toward reassuring Ashworth's throne that Kestral remained committed to genuine, lasting peace, regardless of the troubling circumstances that had originally brought the alliance into being. Within the Kestral court itself, the crisis had begun to fracture the careful loyalty that had, for years, held the kingdom's various noble factions in relative unity. Several lords, long resentful of what they perceived as Cassian's excessive influence over royal decision-making, seized upon the scandal as an opportunity to challenge Damien's judgment more broadly, questioning whether a king so easily manipulated by a single advisor truly possessed the wisdom necessary to continue leading the kingdom through the difficult period of reconstruction that clearly lay ahead. Lord Halbrook, an ambitious noble from the kingdom's southern territories, who had long harbored his own aspirations toward greater influence within the royal court, proved particularly vocal in these criticisms, using several tense council sessions to press Damien on the broader implications of his years-long trust in Cassian's counsel. If the king could be so thoroughly deceived regarding a matter as significant as the foundation of his own marriage, Halbrook argued during one particularly contentious council meeting, what confidence can this court maintain regarding the soundness of his judgment on other critical matters of state? I raise this not to diminish His Majesty, but out of genuine concern for the kingdom's continued stability during this period of considerable uncertainty. Damien, though stung by the implicit challenge to his authority, understood the legitimate concern underlying Halbrook's criticism, even as he recognized the ambitious noble's clear interest in exploiting the crisis for his own political advancement. The council session grew increasingly tense as various lords weighed in, some defending Damien's judgment as understandably compromised by a uniquely skilled and patient manipulator, others echoing Halbrook's concerns with growing boldness. It was Seraphine, perhaps unexpectedly, who spoke most decisively in Damien's defense during this difficult session, her own credibility as a woman who had nearly lost her life to Cassian's desperate final scheme carrying considerable weight within the chamber. Lord Halbrook raises a fair question, Seraphine said, rising to address the assembled council directly. But I would remind this chamber that I too was deceived by Cassian's careful manipulation, as were the many scouts and officers whose honest reports were quietly buried or altered before ever reaching the throne. The failure here belongs to a man skilled enough in deception to fool an entire court, not simply to a single king who trusted, perhaps too deeply, in the counsel of a man who had served the crown faithfully, by all outward appearances, for many years. Her words carried considerable weight within the chamber, tempering some of the harsher criticism that had begun building momentum, though the fundamental question of the kingdom's path forward remained unresolved. Damien, watching Seraphine defend him with a conviction that surprised him, given the complicated, painful history of their arranged marriage, felt a fresh wave of gratitude toward the woman who had, despite everything, become something closer to a genuine ally through the shared trauma of Cassian's manipulation. In the days following this contentious council session, Seraphine approached Damien privately, continuing the honest conversation they had begun months earlier regarding the future of their marriage, now shaped by an entirely different context than either of them had anticipated. I believe, Seraphine said, seated across from Damien in his private study, the candlelight casting long shadows across the room, that the time has come for us to formally address what both of us have known for quite some time. Our marriage, however it began, has not brought either of us the happiness that a genuine union should provide. And now that the manufactured crisis that originally justified it has been so thoroughly exposed, I believe we owe it to ourselves, and to the kingdoms we both serve, to pursue an honest resolution, rather than continuing to maintain an arrangement built upon a foundation we now know to be fundamentally false. You wish to seek an annulment, Damien said, understanding immediately the direction of her careful words. I do, Seraphine confirmed. Not out of anger toward you, Damien, but out of a genuine desire to build a life that reflects my own choices, rather than the manipulated circumstances that originally brought us together. I believe you understand this desire perhaps better than anyone else currently within this castle, given your own recent efforts to reconnect with Elena and your son." Damien considered her words carefully, feeling neither surprise nor significant resistance to the proposal, understanding on some fundamental level that Seraphine's request simply acknowledged a truth both of them had recognized for quite some time. "I will support whatever path you choose," he said. "You deserve the same opportunity for genuine happiness that I have been working, however imperfectly, to rebuild for myself." "Thank you," Seraphine said. And for the first time in their years-long marriage, something that resembled genuine warmth passed between them, born not of romantic affection, but of a shared understanding forged through crisis and betrayal, and a mutual respect for each other's right to pursue lives built on honest foundations, rather than manufactured necessity. The formal process of seeking an annulment, while considerably complicated by the political implications involved, moved forward with the support of both Damien and Seraphine, and crucially, with the eventual blessing of Ashworth's king, who, once fully briefed on the true circumstances surrounding Cassian's manipulation, expressed considerably more sympathy toward Seraphine's position than anger toward Castral's throne. But even as this particular resolution began taking careful shape, the broader crisis facing Damien's reign continued to intensify. Lord Halbrook and several allied nobles, unsatisfied by Seraphine's defense during the earlier council session, continued pressing their case that the kingdom required stronger, more decisive leadership than Damien had thus far demonstrated, particularly given the added complication of an heir born outside the bounds of his marriage to Seraphine, a child whose eventual claim to the throne remained legally and politically uncertain given the unusual circumstances of his birth and the years of separation between his parents. The question of succession, largely dormant during the years of Damien and Seraphine's childless marriage, now surfaced with renewed urgency, various factions within the court debating whether Ronan's claim to the throne, as Damien's only known biological child, held legitimate standing despite the complicated circumstances surrounding his birth and upbringing, or whether the kingdom required a different approach to succession entirely, one that might involve looking beyond Damien's direct bloodline altogether, should the current crisis continue destabilizing confidence in his reign. Damien found himself, in the weeks following Cassian's death and Seraphine's request for annulment, fighting simultaneously on multiple fronts, working to maintain diplomatic stability with Ashworth, navigating the complicated legal and political questions surrounding his marriage's dissolution, addressing growing challenges to his authority from ambitious nobles like Halbrook, and all the while, carrying the deeply personal weight of understanding that every difficult choice of the past 4 years had been shaped, in ways both large and small, by a manipulation he had trusted completely and never thought to question. It was during this period of mounting crisis that Damien finally understood, with a clarity that felt both painful and strangely clarifying, that the crown he had once believed required sacrificing his family to protect had, in reality, been placed in genuine jeopardy, not by any external threat, but by his own misplaced trust in a man who had exploited that trust for years without any of the safeguards a wiser, more careful king might have maintained. The kingdom he had sacrificed so much to protect stood now on more uncertain footing than at any point during his entire reign, and the reckoning still required to fully address that instability remained, in many critical respects, only just beginning. Damien called a full assembly of the royal court on a bright summer morning, months after Cassian's death had first thrown the kingdom into chaos, standing before the gathered nobles, military commanders, and representatives from Ashworth, with a resolve that had been forged through the difficult months of reckoning that preceded this moment. He had spent countless sleepless nights, considering how best to address the crisis that continued to threaten the stability of his reign, and had finally arrived at a decision that surprised many within the chamber, though it reflected a wisdom he had lacked 4 years earlier, when pressure and fear had driven him toward choices that ultimately cost him everything he valued most. "I stand before this court today," Damien began, his voice carrying clearly through the assembled hall, "not to defend my past judgment, but to acknowledge honestly where that judgment failed this kingdom, and to propose a path forward, built on transparency, rather than the secrecy that allowed Cassian's manipulation to flourish unchecked for so many years." He outlined, in careful detail, a series of reforms to the kingdom's governing structure, distributing decision-making authority more broadly among a reconstituted council with strengthened oversight mechanisms, ensuring that no single advisor could again accumulate the kind of unchecked influence Cassian had exploited so effectively. He formally acknowledged Seraphine's annulment request, praising her courage and honesty throughout the difficult months following Cassian's exposure, and confirmed that the dissolution of their marriage would proceed with the full support of both Castral and Ashworth's thrones, an agreement that Ashworth's representatives, satisfied by the genuine effort at transparency Damien now demonstrated, formally accepted. Regarding the question of succession, Damien said, addressing the matter that had generated the most heated debate among the assembled nobles in recent weeks, I will not pretend that my son's claim to this throne is uncomplicated. He was born outside the bounds of a formal marriage, in circumstances that reflect my own failures rather than any fault of his own. I ask this court to consider, honestly, and without the political maneuvering that has too often shaped decisions within these walls, what genuine legitimacy actually requires: bloodline alone, or a demonstrated commitment to ruling with wisdom, honesty, and genuine care for this kingdom's people. Lord Halbrook, who had continued pressing his own ambitions throughout the preceding months, rose to challenge Damien's framing, but found considerably less support among his fellow nobles than he had anticipated, many of them having grown weary of the political maneuvering that had characterized the crisis, and increasingly persuaded by Damien's evident commitment to genuine reform, rather than simple preservation of his own authority. The council session that followed stretched long into the afternoon, careful negotiation gradually shaping a path forward that satisfied, if not everyone's individual ambitions, at least the broader need for stability and legitimate governance that the kingdom required. Ronan's eventual claim to the throne would be formally recognized, contingent upon a period of careful preparation and education befitting a future king, overseen by the reformed council rather than any single advisor, ensuring that the mistakes of Cassian's unchecked influence could not easily be repeated. With the immediate political crisis finally addressed through this careful, transparent process, Damien turned his attention, for the first time in months, fully toward the personal reckoning that had been waiting patiently in the background throughout the kingdom's turbulent reconstruction. He made the journey to Millbrook once more, though this time, rather than the careful secrecy that had characterized his previous visits, he traveled with a modest formal escort, understanding that the time for hiding the truth from his son, and from the wider world, had finally arrived. Elena met him at her cottage door, having received word of his approach through Bethan, who had heard news of the dramatic changes unfolding at Castral Castle, through the same merchant networks that had once nearly exposed Elena's identity years earlier. She studied Damien's face carefully as he approached, noting the visible exhaustion of the preceding months, but also something steadier, more resolved than she had seen in him since their earliest days together in Thornhollow. "It is done then," Elena said, not quite a question. "Seraphine and I have formally begun the process of dissolving our marriage," Damien confirmed. "The council has been reformed, and I have told the entire court the truth about Ronan, about you, about everything Cassian manipulated to drive us apart 4 years ago." Elena absorbed this information carefully, years of guarded caution warring against the cautious hope that had been building steadily throughout Damien's regular visits over the preceding months. "What does this mean?" she asked finally. "For us?" "For Ronan." Damien took a careful breath before answering, understanding that whatever he said next would shape the course of both their lives in ways that extended far beyond the personal reconciliation they had been carefully building. "It means," he said, "that I am asking you, honestly, and without any political pressure or urgent necessity forcing the timeline, whether you would consider a future together, built this time on complete honesty, rather than the secrecy that broke us apart before. Not because Ronan's position at court requires it, though it certainly simplifies matters considerably, but because I have spent these past months rediscovering exactly why I fell in love with you in the first place, and I find that love has only grown stronger through the process of earning back your trust." Elena studied him for a long, quiet moment, the weight of 4 years of hardship and healing, of careful independence built through her own strength and determination, balanced against the genuine, patient reconciliation Damien had demonstrated throughout his months of careful, humble visits to Millbrook. "I will not simply return to being the queen who waits quietly while decisions are made around her," Elena said finally, her voice carrying the same steady resolve that had guided every difficult choice she had made since fleeing Castral Castle years earlier. If we build a future together, Damien, it will be built as true partners, with honesty as our foundation, always. I will not accept anything less, not for myself, and certainly not for the example we set for our son. I would not want anything less, Damien said, and the sincerity in his voice carried a conviction that Elena, watching him carefully, finally allowed herself to fully believe. The conversation that followed, unlike so many of their previous difficult exchanges, unfolded with a gentleness that reflected the genuine healing both of them had undergone over the preceding months. They spoke honestly about the practical challenges ahead, about how to explain the full truth to Ronan, in a way that honored both his security and his right to understand his own history, about how Elena's independent life in Millbrook might be honored and preserved, even as they considered a return to Castral, about the careful, patient work still required to fully rebuild the trust that had been broken years earlier in that fateful throne room announcement. Ronan, when finally told the full truth of his parentage several weeks later, received the news with the same open, curious wonder that had characterized his approach to the world since infancy, more excited by the prospect of learning to ride real horses and seeing an actual castle than troubled by the complicated circumstances surrounding his birth. "So you are truly my father," he said, studying Damien with new understanding during a quiet afternoon conversation in Elena's cottage, "not just a family friend who visits sometimes." "I am," Damien confirmed, kneeling down to meet his son's eyes directly. "And I am sorry, Ronan, that it took me so long to be part of your life properly. I hope, as you grow older, you will let me try to make up for that lost time, even though I know I can never fully replace the years already past." Ronan considered this with the thoughtful seriousness that had always marked his approach to important matters, before finally offering a small, accepting smile. "I would like that," he said simply, "as long as you keep skipping stones with me sometimes, even when you are busy being king." Damien laughed, a genuine warm sound that carried none of the careful restraint that had characterized so much of his life within Castral Castle's formal walls. "I promise," he said, "always." In the months that followed, Elena and Ronan gradually transitioned toward a life that honored both the independence Elena had built in Millbrook and the new relationship slowly forming with Damien and the wider kingdom he governed. She did not rush back into the role of queen, insisting instead on a careful, gradual reintegration that allowed her to maintain her own identity and strength, rather than simply returning to the position she had once occupied, before everything collapsed around her. The kingdom itself, under Damien's reformed leadership, began slowly rebuilding the trust that Cassian's years of manipulation had damaged so severely. The reconstituted council, with its strengthened oversight and distributed authority, proved considerably more resistant to the kind of unchecked influence that had allowed one ambitious advisor to reshape an entire kingdom's political future according to his own hidden ambitions. Seraphine, freed from a marriage that had never reflected her own genuine desires, returned eventually to her homeland of Ashworth, where she began, with the same quiet determination that had characterized her defense of Damien during the darkest days of the crisis, building a life shaped entirely by her own choices, rather than the political necessities that had once defined her existence. And Elena, standing once more within the walls of Castral Castle, nearly a year after Damien's first cautious visit to Millbrook, understood, with a clarity that had taken years of hardship and healing to fully achieve, that the future stretching ahead of her and her son would be built this time not on secrecy or sacrifice, but on the hard-won, carefully rebuilt foundation of honesty, partnership, and a love that had, despite everything that once threatened to destroy it, ultimately proven strong enough to survive its own near-total collapse. The crown that Damien had once chosen over his family had nearly cost him everything that truly mattered, and it was only through the painful, humbling process of losing that certainty entirely that he had finally learned the deeper truth his kingdom, and his family, had always needed him to understand. A throne built on secrets and manufactured necessity could never provide the genuine stability that honest partnership, freely chosen and consistently honored, ultimately made possible, both for a kingdom and for the family that stood, finally, at its rightful, unhidden center.